Critical analysis of the game Satisfactory. Satisfactory pre-explanation and general description. Satisfactory is a first-person factory construction and automation game with single-player and co-op multiplayer. Made by Coffee Stain Studios in Unreal Engine 4, you play as an employee of Fixit Incorporated and must contribute towards project assembly. As an engineer, you are tasked with exploring the planet for resources in order to construct machines which will build necessary parts. As the game progresses, more complex machines and parts become available, which allow the player or players to create tools, weapons, and vehicles. The game was initially released in early access exclusively on the Epic Games Store on March 19, 2019 at 5 p.m. GMT. It later released on Steam on June 8, 2020 at 5 p.m. GMT, with cross-platform multiplayer. The official definition can be found using the link below. Describe your game's formal elements. Formal elements help create a game's structure. The relationship between these formal elements is what forms a game. Number 1. Player. The first formal element are the player. This is anyone that plays the game. The game design calls for the player to interact with the various in-game systems. Players are voluntary, however they are active participants and partake in entertainment that interests them personally. The players therefore can adopt a illusory attitude. This attitude is important for the players to be immersed into the game experience, but can depend on the amount they interact with the systems and how much these systems will interact with them in the game world. It is important to note, however, every single player will have a different play experience based on their actions and the amount that they become immersed in the game world. It is also important to note that each player will facilitate or inhabit a different action, and often will have different play styles that they pick up during their own playthrough. An overview of different player interaction patterns is shown below. Number 2. Objectives. All games have objectives, and that's no different with Satisfactory. The objectives in a game are important to motivate the player to engage in the gameplay. The best game objectives are the ones that are obtainable but seem challenging. It is important to have this balance between challenge and reward to keep the player engaged and immersed into the game. This in most cases involves gaining a lot of XP, experience points, by the end or by staying alive until the end of the level, but in the case of the game Satisfactory, it revolves around gaining resources to upgrade the hub and to further unlock elements that makes the game easier for the survival element and the building elements. The premise of this objective is to aim to build a 100% efficient automatic factory to harvest the planet's resources in order to create and send up complex parts extracted from the factory to send up a space elevator to make a stationary satellite for the interplanetary corporation called Fixit, to in turn colonize the planet. These are your orders from the corporation, and you play as the engineer. When it comes to objectives in games, it's not so straightforward. There are different types of objectives in all types of games. After I state what types of objectives can be found in games, I will discuss which can be found in Satisfactory and how they can affect the player's decisions and in keeping them engaged and immersed. Number 1. Capture. Players have to avoid getting captured or killed whilst destroying some opponent properties, commonly some form of terrain or units. Number 2. Chase. Players have to elude or catch an opponent. Number 3. Race. Players have to reach a goal before anyone else does. Number 4. Alignment. Players have to get some defined units or items to safety without being compromised. Number 6. Forbidden act. Players have to get the opponents to break the rules or to abandon a strategy. Number 7. Construction. Players have to construct, maintain, or manage game objects. Number 8. Exploration. Players have to explore unknown game areas. Number 9. Solution. Players have to solve a problem or puzzle, sometimes before the opponent solve it. And number 10, outwit. Players have to gain and use knowledge to outwit their opponents. Objectives found in Satisfactory. The first objective type we see here in Satisfactory is alignment. This is because the player must gather sufficient resources in order to create factory machines, which in turn help the player gain speed at creating more complex parts, so on and so forth. There is a large process that must be carried out for this, and it is continuous because the player will always need more resources to make their factory better. This creates a motivation and satisfying feeling for the player when they achieve this, which also helps keep them immersed in playing the game. This objective makes the player want to play on, along with the other elements. The second objective type we see in Satisfactory is escape. This objective involves the risk in which the player endures during the game, in order and whilst gathering the resources. This is all part of the gameplay, which revolves around exploration, i.e., the more the player is willing to explore, the more risk that will be involved, but the better or more rewards the player will get. However, they will need to then escape the risk, in this case the environments and the dangerous alien creatures in them, and get back to their safe factory. This idea is a key principle in many open-world games about exploring the unknown. You can either risk your life and potentially find new secrets and progress the game, or stay as long as you want in the known but not progress in the story and just construct your factory and space elevator. In conclusion of this, the player must escape the risk in order to reap the rewards. However, they must strategize to increase their chance of success. If they die while exploring, their inventory will be dropped at their feet, and they will wake up back at their factory with none of the resources that they've collected on their travels, rendering their journey useless. However, they can learn from these mistakes, and this in effect drives them to go back to that area and collect their dropped inventory. Risk and reward, but escaping the environments in order not to be compromised each time. The third objective we see, and is a constant theme throughout Satisfactory, is construction. With this type of objective, the player must construct, maintain, and manage to become more effective with the in-game tasks and to progress in the game. In Satisfactory, there is an abundant supply of natural resources that can be mined from the planet, gathered or found in the different biomes, including deserts, forests, lakes, grass fields, mountains, and caves. In addition to this, there is also crashed ships that can be salvaged for more technical manufactured parts, and there are special story items that give the player a narrative about the planet and its inhabitants. The player must build a factory in order to progress. This process evokes the other game objectives and systems in which are utilized and made fun for the player, keeping them constantly engaged as they choose how they play the game and where they would like to explore next and when. This freedom gives the player a lot of opportunities to go at their speed to build their factory and colonize the planet. The objective of construction spans the entire game. This is its main theme and function. However, the sub-objectives of managing and maintaining are more to do with strategies that the player learns with practice as opposed as main objectives. These do, however, help the player complete the game's objective, especially in construction. Here is a well-said quote I came across from Katina's Park's assistant Steve. "You're on an uncharted alien planet, so try to be careful. Don't go alone if you don't have to, and use protection. Who knows what kind of organisms have made this their home, or who knows what awesome treasures you'll find." This quote describes the risk and reward aspects that directly links back into the objective of construction, and how the player will react in exploring gradually more and more to create a better factory. It's the drive that one has. This can also be said for the other game objectives. Often though, this is not something the players think about, but is more a subconscious decision they act upon, which affects their individual playstyle. However, this can be to do with their preference, what aspects they like and do not like about the game, and fourth, will influence their decision making and affect their playthrough accordingly. The fourth type of objective that is proficiently found in the game Satisfactory is exploration. This is a key part of the player's success in the game. It depends on a few factors. Number one being time. If the player explores slower by choice, then this will affect how long it will take to complete tasks such as progressing through the different hub levels to unlock new items and abilities to help aid them, or by adding content for them to experiment with. This contrasts with someone who might have played the game before. It would take them less time to progress through the game's stages, and exploration is an essential part of this, because it's how you find your resources and depends on how the player utilizes the transportation of themselves and vehicles to and from their factories that can differ between playthrough times. The other factor to consider in the game objective of exploration is immersion. This aspect affects the player's attention span and how engaged they are in playing the game. This can depend and vary on the environments the player navigates. The landmass in Satisfactory is 30 kilometers squared, or 5.4 kilometer times 5.4 kilometers, and was handcrafted. This includes the aforementioned biomes. The world varies in density of resources and items physically, but also in difficulty. More on this later. The fifth game objective in Satisfactory is solution. Solution is present in a lot of construction phases of the game. Whenever the player wants to build something, for example creating an assembly line, not only has the player need to manage their resources, but also manage the efficiency of their assembly lines. This is a big problem that needs to be solved, often by experimenting. The efficiency in Satisfactory is out of 100, and if machines aren't running at 100%, then they will be less effective, meaning they will produce less and hinder the player's progression and immersion. However, much like risk and rewards, the problems in the game are balanced with other aspects like the exploration, and there is always a solution the player can find, learn, obtain, or gain with experience. Once done so, this creates a satisfying feeling for the player, urging them to continue to play the game. Think of it like a circle of problem solving, with good amounts of rewards such as new items and level ups, which gives the player a sense of gratification on their playthrough, no matter what play style they choose. Number 3. Rules. These are the exact objects and concepts of your game. They are the building blocks of the game system. As a game designer, you want to be able to describe the actions for all possible situations in your rule set. Your rule set specifies everything a player can and cannot do. Rules are the authority of your game world. They are like a code of honor that players adhere to when entering play. This is tied to the illusory attitude of being willing to enter the magic circle. If players don't follow the rules, they are leaving the game. In summary of this, rules serve 3 main purposes: defining objects and conditions, restricting player actions, and determining effects on players. In Satisfactory, you can see rules affect the player using the gameplay and all the other intertwined elements running like clockwork, and these rules are set in stone for the player to follow and be guided by. As a set of code defined by Coffee Stain Studios and what they intend the game to be and how they want it to be the best possible play experience for their target audience. Number 4. Resources. These are game objects that have a value for players in reaching their individual objectives. The value of these items can be determined by their scarcity and utility. The value for players, i.e. utility, is often scaled by how much an item helps a player achieve their goal. As a designer, you want to control the availability, i.e. scarcity, of an item. You can help guide the player to find resources, and you can put systems in place that govern how resources are managed and when they become scarce. Common resource examples in games are lives, units, health, currency, actions, inventory, and time. In Satisfactory, for example, resources such as mined ores from the earth are limitless. These deposits give the player the fundamental building blocks to run their factories to manufacture more complex parts that they need whilst using strategy to maximize their efficiency. This type of resource would be inventory that they collect. Another example would be water that the player can use to cool down coal stations, and in which they can use for hydroelectricity plants. Number 5. Conflict. Conflict emerges through procedures and rules in the game that prevent a player from achieving their goal. Objectives often guide players to these conflict situations. The main conflict in many first-person shooters, for example, is to stay alive while a non-player or characters try to kill you. The conflict in pinball would be to keep the ball from rolling out of the playing field. Only the mechanical devices, often flippers, the machines provide to you. 3 types of conflicts are common in games. Number 1, obstacles. These can be in a physical or mental form. Physical obstacles could be the length of your pinball flippers or the bumpers that the ball bounces off. Mental obstacles can be a missing item to complete a riddle in an adventure game, or the challenge of calculating the right numbers in Sudoku. Number 2, opponents. Often other players in a game or computer-controlled enemies. Number 3, dilemmas. These are problematic choices that the player are faced with. It's a strategic decision where the consequences have to be weighed before proceeding. For example, in Satisfactory, the obstacles in this sense would be trying to get the factory fully automatic and operational in order to send parts up the space elevator. The opponents here would be that many of the alien creatures that can potentially kill the player, and the dilemma in Satisfactory would be trying to solve an efficiency problem with the assembly line and trying to make it more flowing and by deciding what is best in order to improve the pace of production in the area the player wants. Number 6, boundaries. This is the border to the real world, the separation of the magic circle and the real world. This also relates to actions that are only possible in a game, but would have much different consequences outside the game boundaries. It can also relate to the playing field, the skybox, or other limiting geometry in your game world. There is a clever way that the developers have devised to create a seamless and effective boundary in Satisfactory. In most games there is a physical boundary, a cliff for example, geometry that will not allow the player past, as that is the end of the game world. Sometimes this can also be simply done by placing an out of bounds message on the screen, and then after a brief short time will physically put the player back in bounds. However, in Satisfactory, the alien world you are on for the entirety of the game is suspended in air as if all landmass is floating, as if there are humongous cliffs that if you fall off you will simply die by falling into the void, losing your inventory for good. It's a smart way of solving one problem that usually takes the player out of the game. Instead, create the world in a way that makes sense by not physically letting the player leave. Number 7, outcome. The outcome of a game must be uncertain to foster player interest. In games, the outcome is often measurable, e.g. points, and uneven, i.e. one team or person must win. Winning conditions are simply different from player objectives. Since players have invested much time and emotion into a game, it is hard to create resolution that satisfies this investment of players. In Satisfactory, the end is rather clear. You have a goal to create a 100% efficient factory without the need of human intervention afterwards, but the process in doing this is also requires the player to send project parts up the space elevator, which has an animation and good sound design that really makes it feel impactful. There is also the satisfaction of spending time on making those parts. For me personally, the drive to play the game was not only to explore and build a factory, but was to do this because of an uncertainty of what comes next. What happens when I send all the required project parts for the space elevator? It is very motivating and made the outcomes more enjoyable. Not only because of the uncertainty, but because the player is never left with nothing to do. There is always something to do, and all depends on how much time the player is willing to spend. Factor in immersion and voila, you have an effective game. This is my unbiased opinion. This concludes the formal elements of a game defined and explained within different concepts, with differing examples referring to the game Satisfactory. What is the style of the game? Here are the most common styles found in games today. Number 1, sandbox, for example, Minecraft, Grand Theft Auto, and The Sims. Number 2, real-time strategy, RTS, for example, Warcraft, Age of Empires, and Command and Conquer. Number 3, shooters, FPS and TPS, for example, Halo, Gears of War, and Doom. Number 4, multiplayer online battle arenas, MOBA, for example, Dota 2, League of Legends, and Smite. Number 5, role-playing, RPG, ARPG, and more, for example, Skyrim, The Witcher 3, and Fallout 4. Number 6, simulation and sports, for example, Forza Motorsport, Maiden, NFL, and NBA 2K. Number 7, puzzlers and party games, for example, Jackbox Party Pack, the Talos Principle, and Portal 2. Number 8, action adventure, for example, Star Wars Jedi, Fallen Order, Seriko, Shadows Die Twice, and Assassin's Creed. Number 9, survival and horror, for example, The Long Dark, Don't Starve, and Resident Evil. Number 10, platformer, for example, Cuphead, Crash Bandicoot, and Ori and the Blind Forest. Satisfactory can be defined having more than one style. Its main style is sandbox, however some may also consider it to be a puzzler and role-playing in addition. Its formal elements is what makes it a certain style, but mostly its open world aspect that interests and operates flawlessly within everything else to define it as a sandbox survival adventure game. However, using the word survival loosely here, in the sense that the player must strategize and prevent themselves from dying to make progress, as opposed to the usual survival elements like different bars such as hunger. However, there are a health bar and on-screen prompts like redness and sound design to signal and tell the player when they are losing health, at when and at what percentage. Most commonly, this would be caused by the aliens inhabiting the planet or the dangerous environments. Procedures. These are actions or methods of play allowed by a game's rules. They can be specific instructions of what actions to take during play. They can also refer to a specific set of controls. In a computer game, they would serve to process the input of a player. Procedures can specify actions that are impossible or inefficient outside of the magic circle of the game. Essentially, you have to answer who does what, where, and when, and how. Player actions, as specified by procedures, can be split up into the following. Starting, how the game is put into play, also leading into onboarding of the players. In Satisfactory, this is done through an opening cutscene where the player is in a spacecraft about to enter the atmosphere of the unknown planet to start the colonization. More so, however, the player starts with the tools like the builder tool given to them by Fixit. After the player lands, you are instructed to dismantle your spacecraft to gain the starting materials you need to build the hub. Fixit's motto is all about efficiency, using what you have at your disposal, and the art of gathering and exploring to utilize this. This is where the strategies tend to come in. Progression. These are the ongoing procedures running during gameplay. During the gameplay of Satisfactory, there are different ways that all lead to the same progression route. The main type of progression through its story is through the hub interface. This is where the player has to create parts and send a rocket to space for research purposes. When the rocket returns, the player unlocks new items and gadgets. This is the game's way of keeping the player motivated, using a level up system. This is the main procedure, however, that is recurring during the game as the player experiments and plays at their own pace. Special. These are actions that are only available based on other elements and changes to the game state. Another type of procedure found in many games are called specials. For example, in Satisfactory, the game developers create events based upon times of the year, such as festivities like Christmas, Easter, or Halloween. This creates a motivation for players to play around these times to get them to engage into the game and tell others by using new items and reward systems like advent calendars and presents that can be found in the game, which gives the players different items and parts each time. Sometimes relating to that event, for example, if you found one of the many presents that are dropped in the game over Christmas, you may be rewarded with decorations that the player can choose to use. Another example of specials as a type of procedure are story events. These are things that is based on the player's need to work out how to get the sufficient power to the crate, and so it depends solely on their actions or their teammates if they are playing co-op multiplayer. Resolving. These actions bring your game to an end. As Satisfactory is not a narrative driven as it would be as if it were, for example, in the Far Cry or Uncharted universe and franchise. No, Satisfactory doesn't rely on cutscenes to give the player the narrative of emotions that the developers want. Instead, it's about motivating the player to always build bigger and better, or efficiency in this case, to continuously improve. This in mind, there is an end goal that the player needs to work towards. The ultimate goals of the game are to build a fully automated factory that can manufacture any item without requiring the player's manual intervention and to deliver all required project parts to the space elevator. This is another key procedure type in the way that the game resolves most effectively and to the developer's intention as originally as intended, or the ideas and planning methods that they use. In terms of playstyle, however, Satisfactory is an automation-focused sandboxed game, quite similar like Factorio but 3D. What makes an effective game? The foundation of game design is that all games have players, objectives, a system of rules and feedback. All these together make a game a game. The key to success when making an effective game is all the elements and aspects to do with story and gameplay and how these interact with the other game systems that truly make a game effective. This is true for Satisfactory. The developers at Coffee Stain Studios have utilized many techniques to bring this game alive, using the story, but more importantly, the gameplay in which, in this instance, has already been explained above. However, in my opinion, I think there is more to what makes Satisfactory so enjoyable as an interactive experience, and why it is essentially an effective game. This is to do with how the game has been produced and released to the public, and more specifically its target audience. You see, Satisfactory is not yet at version 1.0 as its full game. It's being released in stages, each coming as separate updates, such as update 1 to 5 currently, but is being continuously play tested by the public as well as game testers to constantly make the game better and improve the game so much that by the time it's fully released, there will be very little if any bugs present in the game. but also the story and gameplay would be improved, making it an even more effective game standalone. This is done using feedback forms anyone can submit using the in-game feedback options and debugger. What makes a game engaging? Game engagement refers to the player's commitment to the gaming activities. Deeply engaged players are fully focused on the gaming activities and are not aware of the things taking place around them. Immersion and flow are central concepts in many studies related to the game engagement. Video games engage the player on multiple levels by creating rewards, obstacles, stories, character traits, and increasing levels of difficulty as the player increases their level of skill in the game. In Satisfactory, this is done using the reward systems, as mentioned, which keeps the player engaged and motivated to continue. The moment a player loses motivation on the task at hand is when they lose interest in the game. Does your game have a strategy? If so, what is it? Well, the simple answer here is yes. Satisfactory does have a strategy, and is well executed, unlike some other games like Sims, for example. Satisfactory's main strategy and focus is upon efficiency, and this is made clear in the game through dialogue of the computer's interface, which communicates to you as you make milestones, especially whilst progressing through the hub levels in the game. Players also find out on their own why it is key to plan their factories and upgrade to better produce items and parts. This is the strategy of in context in the game. However, another concept of strategy found in Satisfactory is marketing. In order to produce more revenue and playtime between players to debug and get ready for its big release, the developers at Coffee Stain would have had a marketing strategy from the beginning to maximize profits and in turn success. Within 3 months of its release in early access, over 500,000 copies had been sold. By July 2020, more than 1.3 million copies had been sold. Based on data collected by Simon Carless in mid-2021, Satisfactory had made at least $11.5 million in revenue, surpassing the amount that Epic Games had assumed as a minimum payout to Coffee Stain. This is their progression and proof of a successful strategy so far. Does the game have cutscenes, and how do they help the game? There are no major narrative cutscenes present in Satisfactory, apart from the opening cutscene of which the player lands on the planet sent there by Fixit to colonize the planet and gain the corporation profit. This has been explained above in the way that the player begins their journey. Not having cutscenes in the game does not derive anything from the enjoyable experiences of the game, however. In fact, it helps the game keeping the player focused on what it is they need to do. Instead of using cutscenes, the AI assistant narrator guides the player and gives them information when milestones have been reached. What draws the player into the game? There is a theory which states that human behavior is driven by the need for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. If those needs are met, we enjoy activities more, even in gaming. Competence is fulfilled in games through flow, which is a completely focused mental state and is used to explain the enjoyment of games and can be used to measure engagement with games of all types and styles, no matter how the player plays the game. In Satisfactory, the player can be drawn into the game in many ways, this mainly being the way that they first become aware of the game, in most cases through advertisement. The type of thought that would be related to this would be, ooh, look at that looks good, I want to play that. But what makes a game attractive and actually draws them in? Well, for a start, it's the aesthetic of the game and its branding, i.e. title, colour palette, that affects its look and feel. Everyone has their own preference, but in Satisfactory the aesthetic style is realism, first-person strategic building and exploration in a vibrant world full of wonders and secrets that attract someone to play this game. How would you describe the pacing of the game? For a start, what is pacing? Pacing can be a tool used for keeping the player interested in the game. It can be used to convey certain emotions to the players and helps control impact of the events to the player. In Satisfactory, as far as pacing goes, it's about how much exploring the player achieves in order to complete the phases of the hub leveling up system. This is how the pacing works in Satisfactory, and is effective because rather than being bound to a linear story, the player can explore and interpret things at their pace. In what way does the game feel immersive? A video game is truly immersive when a player is completely wrapped up in the virtual experience in front of them. The easiest way to achieve a strong level of immersion is to make the game world feel as believable as possible, in every conceivable way. There are several ways in which developers can create elevated levels of immersion in their games. The first being graphic immersion. Graphical fidelity and a game's art style play a huge role in immersive design. While a game doesn't need to have photorealistic graphics to be immersive, it must feel free of any noticeable visual glitches during gameplay. Errors such as two objects clipping into each other will instantly snap players back into reality as they gawk at the strange phenomenon. In Satisfactory, this is achieved through its art style and gameplay elements. However, as the game is in early access, there are some noticeable bugs that can be seen from time to time that can take the player out of the moment. The second way to make the game feel immersive is through storytelling. Much like a great book or a bingeable TV show, a game with a great story can be incredibly difficult to put down. It is quite easy to keep a player immersed for hours on end if they want to see what happens next in the narrative. Although there is not a strong mission or narrative-driven objective path to follow in Satisfactory, it does in fact still use storytelling to utilize the full immersion effects. For example, the story in which the player learns about at the beginning of the game and the premise of the game helps motivate and further immerse the creativity. This along with great visual cues that make the player feel enjoyment. The third way to immerse players into a game is through immersive acting. The acting quality is another huge component of immersive game design. Voice actors need to speak their lines believably and confidently. If the actors sound bored, awkward, or disinterested while reading their lines, players will be too bored to focus on the narrative of the game. In Satisfactory, the main protagonist in which the player plays through does not speak. However, much of the acting is instead done through the interface assistant AI system, which acts as a sort of chaperone from Fix-It. Not in the way that she looks after you, but is there constantly guiding you along your journey in the game. What challenges did the player face? What actions can the player take to? Players can face many challenges while playing the game, whether this is being strategic, logical, mental, or physical challenges in the game. There are also many ways in taking action on these to solve the problems at hand, depending on the game and type of game genre that the player is playing. However, in Satisfactory, the main challenge the player will face is the optimization of their factory, and how to get required materials and parts to progress. The game doesn't give much advice, nor holds the player hand to guide them. Instead, the player is often left to experiment, which is in a lot of cases can take time. But this is one of the reasons it's so satisfying once a problem is solved. For example, If you want to make as many iron rods and iron plates as possible using one pure iron node, you will have to do the math and decide how many smelters and how many constructors you will need. You need to do this by pressing E on the parts of the assembly line to see what efficiency it's running at. Sometimes you may need to self-balance the conveyor belts and create mergers and splitters to accommodate this. How do you overcome those challenges? As I mentioned before, the player can experiment until finding the right solutions to the challenges. However, another way to overcome the trickier challenges, if the player so chooses, that one of the physical actions they can take to overcome this challenge is by viewing tutorials made by others to learn the processes and ways on how to solve these challenges, often using different methods, so they can better optimize their own factory and in turn make more progress doing so. What is the game's intended audience? Is the game appropriate for that audience? First off, what is target audience? Your game's target audience is the demographics and interests of the majority of its players. For example, if you're launching a match-free puzzle game, your target audience is likely female, 35 years of age, and cares mostly about achievement over all aspects of the game. In Satisfactory, I would say its target audience is most likely teens and young adults, anywhere from 16 to 25. Obviously, this range can vary though. It's for people who like achievement and are not all keen on narrative-driven, complicated stories in games, but like a challenge and strategizing through Satisfactory's building elements. So yes, this makes it appropriate for the audience who plays the game. Is the game ethical? If so, why? The principal areas to consider when talking about game ethics is it addictive? Are there loot boxes? Is gambling involved? Are there dark patterns present? And violence? When it comes to addictiveness, the reward center in the brain releases dopamine in response to a pleasurable experience or hyperarousal. If a person experiences hyperarousal while playing video games, the brain associates the activity with dopamine. The person develops a strong drive to seek out the same pleasure again and again. This, however, can happen on a case-by-case basis, but certain aspects in the game can help determine what makes Satisfactory addictive as a game, much like it provides escapism and separation from the real world. Every aspect down to the smallest details can affect the change in this difference in people. From gameplay elements, formal elements as mentioned earlier, and the game's mechanics all play a part here. Loot boxes have been defined as features in video games which may be accessed through gameplay or purchased with in-game items, virtual currencies, or directly with real-world money. They often appear as chests, crates, or card packs. Loot boxes are virtual treasure chests containing undisclosed items that can be used in games. These might be ways of customizing characters or weapons, skins. These contents may affect progress through the game or simply be designed to convey status. Myself, along with a lot of other people, see loot boxes as unethical as they promote gambling and are generally frowned upon by the gaming communities. Luckily, Satisfactory does not convey this message, as they do not contain loot boxes. Now let us talk about dark patterns in games, and if they are in Satisfactory. A dark game design pattern is a pattern used intentionally by a game creator to cause negative experiences for players which are against their best interests and likely to happen without their consent. Examples of this can not only be found in games, but are found in the real world too, such as bait and switches, disguised ads, forced continuity, hidden costs, friend spam, price comparison prevention, and misdirection are the common dark user experience examples. Satisfactory does not include any of these examples, as the game promotes and involves a great sense of true freedom, in which allows the player to continue at their pace without any cause of bad intentions. forced continuity, or anything else for that matter that purposely degrades the player's experience by the developers for gain, simply letting fun be fun in the case of Satisfactory. Now to talk about violence in video games. Where do we start? There has been countless articles and debates on violence in video games and how it affects society. However, let us start by defining what violence in games means. According to the California law, they define video game violence in 150 words as, in part, as a video game in which the range of options available to the player includes killing, maiming, dismembering, or sexually assaulting an image of a human being. This can affect its PEGI and ESRB ratings. Satisfactory is rated PEGI 3 and does not involve physical violence upon humans. However, you can attack and kill alien creatures in-game, but this does not deviate from its secondary goal of not being a violent game. In conclusion, yes, Satisfactory is ethical, for the reasons being that number 1, it does not contain loot boxes, number 2, it does not include hidden dark patterns, and number 3, it does not inherently promote violence, nor does it affect one's level of being more violent in society. However, it would be important to note here that Satisfactory is quite an addictive game, and to people who get addicted to these games, into these in-game activities, and being immersed in the game may cause a distraction from the real events of their life. This depends on other circumstances, however, and I personally don't think this makes the game unethical, but instead shows it as a successful, effective game, as to the point that it doesn't ruin people's lives, as with gambling or strong violence, or although as I don't believe you can become more violent by playing video games, but that's another debate. So to summarize, no, Satisfactory is not an unethical game for the reasons stated and explained above. What is the goal of the game? I have already explained what the overall goal of Satisfactory is, but to recap, the ultimate goals of the game are to build a fully automated factory that can manufacture any item without requiring the player's manual intervention, and to deliver all required project parts to the space elevator. If you are looking for an answer to what is the player's mental goal as intended by the developer, then it would be to simply have fun and give feedback on how it can be even better. This can then come down to what makes a game fun. I have already talked a bit about these areas, and this is to do with all the elements and objectives from the beginning, but fundamentally, in any case, and in the case of Satisfactory, video games are fun when players can relate to their characters. Video games are fun when players feel like they are in control. Video games are fun when they make you feel part of something. Video games are fun when they take your mind off of problems. This is achieved from the goal of the game Satisfactory. Is the game largely mechanical or psychological? Before I answer this, I would like to define what the difference between these two traits are. A mechanical game is any game based on chance rather than skill, where psychological games are slightly more complicated and is to do with the theory which states that human behavior is driven by the need for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. Basing my answer from this definition, I would say Satisfactory is largely psychological. Psychology in games, however, can also be linked to addiction and how it can change when subjected to reward and motivation systems in video games, resulting in the release of dopamine. This is much more common in Satisfactory, and you can refer to when I explained these different systems in the game earlier on. The game does not rely on mechanical systems and structure to display all of its integral features, as the player very rarely, if ever, relies on luck, unless you are referring to the chance of finding needed items and resources during exploration. But other than that, the game solely is about how the player can utilize strategy with skill to make progress, making this a psychological game. Which kind of skill does a player need quick reactions, typical in shooters for example, or careful deliberation. In Satisfactory, the player doesn't typically need quick reactions, as it is not a shooter. However, they may need quick reactions when it comes to attacking the aliens. Some of the aliens are fast and require speedy reactions to win the fight. More specifically, aiming of the mouse and not missing an attack, as well as dodging. In Satisfactory, the player needs careful deliberation. This is because if the player doesn't take time to think and plan of what they will need to do next, then it may hinder their progress. For example, they need to plan what they need to build next and how they will go about doing it. Other skills players may need to success at mastering the game would be risk-taking, patience and perseverance, problem-solving, strategizing, and concentration. What are the dynamics of being ahead or behind in the game? Generally, adding additional mechanics, new systems, additional game objects, and new ways for objects to interact with one another, or for players to interact with the game, will lead to a greater complexity in the dynamics of the game. This also changes the dynamics if the player were behind or ahead in games, such as a game that has multiple players and involves level ups and lots of competition, though not exclusive. In Satisfactory, however, this is not the case. It is not possible for the player to be ahead or behind in the game in terms of story dynamics. However, with the freedom the game gives, there can in fact be one major dynamic change, and that is time. The amount of time a player takes to find resources to upgrade their factory, for example. This would mean that they are behind, but on their terms. The game has different circumstances and outcomes for each person who plays the game, therefore changes the dynamics of the physicality of the game, but for each playthrough accordingly, and depending on what actions the player takes at any given time. What phases does the game naturally fall into? Phases ideally not include changes in the rules, but may include cases where rules that did not matter earlier in the game come to matter later on, or where rules are added through acquisition of loot, or cards, or perks, or levels. For example, there may be a rule that limits the number of pieces a player can have, perhaps reflecting supply or maintenance restrictions. This rule may not matter at the beginning of the game, but will as players build up their forces. In terms of Satisfactory, their resources. There are a few types of phases that can be found in video games. The first being episodic games. This means some games don't have phases. They are episodic. You play several times rather than once, sometimes with best out of 2 or 3, determining the winner, sometimes with more complex scoring. Video fighting games tend to be of this type, but many traditional 52 card games are the most obvious example. Another type can be flow and learning. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's concept of the flow has been adopted by many, for example Ralph Costa, as a model for games. Koska talks about games as learning in a safe environment. Phases means there's more to learn in the game. If the phases don't involve rules changes, all the better. The learning is about how to play well, not about how to deal with the new mechanisms of the game. Phases don't necessarily mean the game become harder to play as well, but they may still contribute to the flow. Virtually all games involve repetition, whether it's repetition of turns or something else. The question is whether the repetition can be conducted in varying circumstances, which amount to different phases. You can play 2 rounds with exactly the same rules, yet the results from the first round mean that what goes on in the minds of the players in the second round is rather different. This is most likely to be seen in Euro-style board games with a limited number of rounds in each, in which a lot can happen. In Satisfactory, the main phase that is very prominent in the game is repetition. As you have probably gathered already, it evolves around gaining sufficient resources which you can never have too much of. It's key that the player goes exploring and finds this out for themselves. Exploration may happen in phases also, but is inherently linked to the overarching theme of repetition, in order to progress with the game through the hub interface, for example. Is the game ruthless or nice, a competition or an entertainment? Competitive games are those in which players play against one another and where one player wins and another loses. Two-player games are often competitive, with a distinct win or lose outcome. Even one-player games can be competitive when a player plays against himself or is given a standard. This is not the case in Satisfactory, however, unless you count competing against oneself, such as better improvement, then there are hints of this in the game. The definition of entertainment in games is that a game is designed to give pleasure to the player while the player is actively involved in in-game activities. Although entertainment games are not specifically designed for purposeful learning, incidental learning happens while playing such games. And this is the case in Satisfactory. It is a game intended for entertainment that this definition sums up quite well. In Satisfactory, the player learns and gains experience the more they play, creating a deeper enjoyment for the game which makes them want to see where it can go. It makes them want to play on. And so, in terms of this question, the game is nice, in terms of entertainment purposes, which it achieves successfully, as described and explained, not only here but mentioned earlier on as well. This entertainment factor is deep-rooted in many of the game's elements that I have talked about today. What is the genre of the game? Satisfactory is a factory simulation game created by Swedish video game developer Coffee Stain Studios. It is a 3D first-person open-world exploration factory building game. This is another simple description of the game. However, its genre would come under indie and strategy, as it involves a lot of strategic elements embedded within the game. Is it a symmetric or asymmetric game? Let us start by understanding what symmetric games are. In game theory, a symmetric game is a game where the payoffs for playing a particular strategy depend only on the other strategies employed, not on who is playing them. If one can change the identities of the players without changing the payoff to the strategies, then a game is symmetric. At its most basic, I think an asymmetrical game as a game where the players start with differences. For example, Catan is not an asymmetrical game because before a settlement is placed, every player has the same resources, rules, and abilities. Scythe, on the other hand, is asymmetrical because each player has a faction with unique abilities and different starting positions on the board. Another way of putting this is symmetry in a game begins to break down very rapidly in longer games, where players have different strategic options, so most symmetric games are short, or rely more heavily on tactics than long-term strategy. Asymmetric games are those games where the players do not stand on equal ground. This makes Satisfactory a symmetric game, in the terms that it doesn't rely on long-term strategic, but more importantly on the tactics the player uses in the moment to achieve a more long-term strategic goal in the game. That is Satisfactory's premise. Conclusion. In conclusion, Satisfactory is a very complicated game that does not take too long to understand. It is one of those games that is easy to play, but hard to master. I would highly recommend buying this game and supporting the developers to improve the game even further. Yes, it has its bugs and its problems, which I have talked a bit about, but in all, it's an effective game and a breath of fresh air compared to the other older, similar, yet different games like Factorio, which I know is a fan favourite, but if you like the theme and ideas of that game, of which inspired this game, then an open world version with many fun elements and gameplay is just for you. This concludes my full, unbiased, critical analysis for Satisfactory.